Welcome to my channel. Today we dive into a story that starts with something so small, so ordinary, that no one on board could have ever imagined how it would end. It was just a toothpick, a tiny piece of wood that fell from a pilot's hand, and yet it became the clue that unraveled one of the most haunting mysteries in aviation history. The flight began like any other, a calm morning sky stretching endlessly over the Pacific, the engines humming in perfect rhythm as Flight 721 prepared for takeoff from San Francisco International Airport. Passengers settled into their seats, flight attendants moved gracefully down the aisle, and the captain, a man known for his calm composure, checked his instruments one last time. Nothing was out of place. The air smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the kind of sterile comfort that only air travel provides. But hidden beneath that calm, behind the metallic walls of the cockpit, was something no checklist could have revealed, something waiting for one small moment to slip through the cracks. As the plane ascended into the thin blue above the clouds, Captain Richard Hall leaned back slightly, adjusting his seatbelt. He was a man who believed in order, precision, and ritual. And one of those rituals was strange but harmless. He always kept a wooden toothpick between his fingers during takeoff. It helped him focus, he said, a small habit from his days as a young pilot. His co-pilot, First Officer Mason Reed, used to laugh about it. "One day you're going to drop that thing and we'll find it jammed in the throttle," he'd joke. They both laughed. But today Mason didn't laugh. Because the moment that toothpick slipped from Richard's hand, tumbling between the throttle levers, something in the cockpit changed. It was subtle at first, just a faint resistance when he tried to push the throttle forward to level off at cruising altitude. The engines responded slower than usual. Mason frowned. "Captain, your throttle's lagging." Richard tried again, and the lever jammed halfway. He forced it forward, the metal creaking under his palm. The vibration was wrong, too sharp, too uneven. Something small had found its way where it shouldn't be. They exchanged uneasy glances. The autopilot engaged, steadying the climb, but the tension in the cockpit grew heavier with every mile. The passengers, blissfully unaware, watched sunlight pour through their windows while below, something unseen was already setting the stage for disaster. Flight 721 leveled off at 35,000 feet, the sky crystal clear above the ocean. In the cabin, a mother read to her son, a businessman typed a last-minute report, and a flight attendant smiled as she served breakfast. It all seemed so normal, so peaceful. But up front, Mason noticed the right engine temperature creeping higher. "Captain, check engine 2, he said. Richard's brow furrowed. The readings didn't make sense. The sensors flickered, the fuel flow spiked, then dropped, then spiked again. He tapped the gauge, it stayed erratic. "Could be electrical interference," Richard muttered. Mason ran a quick diagnostic. The systems were fine. So what was it? They couldn't have known that the toothpick, the one that had slipped through a small gap near the throttle housing, had rolled perfectly into the linkage between the right and left throttles, wedging itself in a place so precise that no one could have planned it. It was holding the right engine just a fraction tighter than the left. That imbalance would soon become deadly. Hours passed, and turbulence began to rattle the plane. The sky outside darkened into rolling clouds, flashes of lightning streaking in the distance. "Weather ahead looks rough," Mason said. Richard nodded. "We'll adjust altitude." He reached for the controls again, but the throttle felt heavy, unwilling. He pulled harder, the plane jerked slightly, and Mason's warning light blinked red across his panel. "Engine 2's overheating," Mason said. "Throttle response is uneven." Richard's heart sank. He could feel the resistance again, the strange stiffness that shouldn't be there. He tried to disengage autopilot, manually adjusting power, but the system pushed back. The turbulence worsened, and the plane began to dip slightly to the right. "We're losing balance," Mason said, voice tightening. The passengers felt it, a soft tilt, then a slow correction. Most thought it was just turbulence. But inside the cockpit, every second was building pressure. The flight engineer, Carla Jennings, ran checks on hydraulics and fuel systems, but nothing appeared wrong on paper. Yet outside, the right engine now glowed faintly red as friction burned within. They radioed air traffic control. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, unaware of the creeping chaos. Flight 721, confirm slight deviation from course. Are you experiencing turbulence? Richard's voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. Affirmative, minor control issue, adjusting manually. He didn't dare mention the jammed throttle. Pilots didn't like to admit mechanical failure, especially not one that might have been caused by something so absurd, so small. But every pilot knows the truth. Small things can bring giants down. Then came the sound, a faint metallic crack under the captain's seat. The throttle suddenly lurched forward on its own, the right engine roaring to full thrust. Mason grabbed the controls. "Engine 2's spooling out of sync," he shouted. The aircraft tilted sharply, alarms blaring. "Disengage power," Richard yelled. But the jam was complete now. The toothpick had splintered under the pressure, wedging deeper. The right engine refused to throttle down. Passengers screamed as the plane rolled violently to one side, coffee cups and trays flying through the air. The flight attendants held onto their jump seats, shouting instructions through the panic. In the cockpit, Mason fought the controls while Richard switched the engine to manual override. "Shut it down," Mason cried. "It won't shut down," Richard shouted back. "It's not responding." The vibration became unbearable, the whole fuselage shuddering under the strain. Then a sharp, ear-splitting bang echoed through the cockpit. A blade fragment had torn through engine 2, sending debris into the wing. "We've lost thrust," Carla screamed. "Hydraulic pressure's falling." The plane began to descend, its nose tipping downward as the sky outside turned from gray to storm-black. Lightning danced across the windshield. The passengers clutched their seats, some praying, others frozen in disbelief. "Mayday, mayday, mayday," Richard called, his voice steady but urgent. "This is Flight 721, right engine failure, partial control loss, descending from 35,000 feet. Air traffic control came alive with static and instructions. Flight 721, maintain heading, prepare for emergency descent, nearest runway 300 miles east." But 300 miles might as well have been 3,000. The aircraft shuddered violently, one wing dragging, the other barely holding lift. Mason worked the rudder, trying to compensate, but the controls felt sluggish. "We're losing hydraulic power to the ailerons," Carla warned. "Try manual," Richard ordered. The storm outside intensified, sheets of rain slamming against the fuselage. The cabin lights flickered, oxygen masks dropped, and the passengers' screams became one continuous wave of terror. Through the chaos, Richard's eyes caught something impossible, a small sliver of wood jammed between the throttle bases, almost invisible beneath the flickering light. His mind flashed back to that simple moment, the careless drop, the sound of it rolling away. His breath hitched. "Oh God," he whispered. "It's the toothpick." He didn't have time to explain. Every second mattered now. He reached down, trying to dislodge it, but the metal was red-hot. His fingers burned instantly. "We can't stabilize," Mason shouted. "We're losing altitude fast." "Brace for impact," Richard said, his voice breaking but calm. He looked at Aria's photo, his wife, taped to the dash. Then, against every instinct, he wrapped his hand in his flight manual, jammed it down into the gap, and yanked the toothpick free. The throttle instantly released, the power leveling for a split second, but the relief came too late. The right engine, already beyond recovery, exploded outward, tearing through the wing's internal frame. The aircraft lurched violently as half its lift vanished. Inside the cabin, time fractured into chaos. Passengers screamed as the plane spiraled, pieces of luggage crashing from overhead bins. Lightning illuminated faces pale with fear. "Pull up!" Mason cried, wrestling the yoke with all his strength. Richard's arms trembled as he tried to help. The sound of the alarms filled every inch of the cockpit, each one screaming a different warning. The ocean appeared below, dark and endless. "We're too low," Carla shouted. "Not yet," Richard said through gritted teeth. "Not yet." He forced the remaining engine to full power, straining against gravity. The plane's nose lifted slightly, just enough. The tail struck the surface first, breaking apart on impact, the fuselage skipping across the water before splitting in two. Then, silence. Hours later, rescue crews found survivors clinging to debris. The ocean was littered with fragments of metal, plastic, and memories. Captain Richard Hall was pulled from the wreckage, still gripping the throttle control. Mason and Carla survived with injuries. Investigators would later uncover the truth. A splintered piece of wood lodged deep inside the throttle housing, a single toothpick responsible for the imbalance that led to catastrophe. The report called it human error, a failure of procedure, but among pilots it became something else, a haunting reminder of how fragile perfection can be. In the years that followed, Flight 721 became a case study in aviation training, a story told not just about technology or error, but about humanity itself, how even the smallest choices can carry the weight of 100 lives. The toothpick was displayed in a museum under glass, labeled simply, Evidence Exhibit 721. To most, it was a tragic relic, but to those who survived, it was a lesson that life is a series of moments, and sometimes, one moment can change everything. And if you found this story as gripping as I did, remember to subscribe to the channel for more real-life air disaster stories that reveal the courage, mystery, and heartbreak behind the headlines. Thank you for watching, and may every flight you take remind you just how fragile and precious life truly is. The wreckage of Flight 721 was scattered across nearly 40 miles of open ocean, glinting in the pale dawn light like pieces of broken glass. The waves lapped gently against twisted metal and torn fabric, a quiet mockery of the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Search and rescue helicopters cut across the horizon, their spotlights sweeping the waves in desperate arcs. What they found was both miraculous and haunting. Among floating debris, seat cushions, and fragments of the fuselage, several survivors clung to life. Captain Richard Hall, burned and bruised, drifted on a piece of shattered paneling, his hand still locked around a piece of the throttle lever. He was conscious, but barely. His once crisp uniform was shredded, his face streaked with soot and salt water. Every breath he took came with pain, yet he refused to let go of the metal piece in his hand, as if it were the only proof that what had happened wasn't just a nightmare. The Coast Guard pulled him from the water, wrapping him in a thermal blanket, their voices a blur against the distant thunder of helicopter blades. "You're lucky to be alive," one rescuer said. But as Richard looked out over the endless blue, he couldn't help but whisper, "No one here was lucky." Back on shore, as dawn turned to morning, emergency crews lined the coast. Paramedics worked frantically, treating the injured, while investigators began the grim task of cataloging wreckage. Survivors were few, each one shaken and dazed, their stories fragmented by trauma. First Officer Mason Reed sat on a stretcher, shivering under a blanket, staring at the ocean. His hands wouldn't stop trembling. Every few seconds he'd mutter, "The right engine wouldn't respond, it just wouldn't stop." The paramedic tried to calm him, but Mason's mind was somewhere else, replaying those final moments in the cockpit, the sounds of metal groaning, alarms screaming, the captain's hand disappearing into the gap beneath the throttles. Flight engineer Carla Jennings sat nearby, her face pale, a deep cut running along her forehead. "He pulled it out," she whispered to herself, voice hollow. "He pulled it out, but it was too late." News of the crash broke before noon. The footage hit every major network. The black plume of smoke rising from the ocean, the aerial shots of debris, the line of stretchers along the shore. Reporters swarmed the scene, their microphones reaching for any soundbite that could make sense of the tragedy. Officials confirmed that Flight 721, bound for Honolulu, suffered a catastrophic engine failure before impact, one voice said over the footage. Preliminary reports suggest a mechanical malfunction, but investigators are not ruling out pilot error. Those words hit Richard like a blade when he heard them later from his hospital bed. Pilot error. 2 words that could destroy a career, a reputation, a man's entire life. He tried to speak, but his throat was raw. The nurse beside him adjusted his her expression kind but distant. "You're lucky to be alive, Captain," she said softly. He turned his head toward the window, the sunlight too bright. "Tell that," he rasped, "to the ones who aren't." By the 3rd day, the National Transportation Safety Board arrived. The investigation team was led by Elaine Matthews, a sharp, calm woman known for her precision. She had spent 20 years decoding tragedies like this one, but something about Flight 721 felt different. "Engine failure doesn't explain the imbalance," she said, staring at the simulation data. "And the throttles, why did they jam at different positions?" Her assistant, Nolan, flipped through a binder. Preliminary inspection of the debris shows burn marks and stress fractures on the right throttle linkage. Something obstructed it mid-flight. "Obstructed?" Elaine repeated. "By what?" Nolan hesitated. "They don't know yet. There's a report of some foreign object found near the base, but it's splintered. Could be composite material." Elaine frowned. "Or wood." She leaned back in her chair, her mind turning. "There's no wooden component near the throttles. Not in this model. Whatever that was, it wasn't supposed to be there." While investigators combed through flight data, Richard was interrogated in his hospital room. A recorder clicked on as 2 men in suits stood at his bedside. "Captain Hall, can you recall what happened in the cockpit prior to the engine imbalance?" Richard's voice was hoarse. "Everything was normal until climb out. Throttle felt stiff." One investigator leaned forward. "Stiff how?" "Like something was caught inside it," Richard said. "It didn't move cleanly. I thought it was friction or heat expansion." "And when did you notice it was jammed?" "After leveling off. Engine 2 started running hotter than normal." "You didn't declare an emergency at that point?" Richard's jaw tightened. "We didn't have cause yet. I thought I could manage it manually." The second man spoke colder. "So you delayed declaring an emergency until it was too late." Richard stared at him, the pain in his chest sharper now. "I delayed nothing," he said. "I was trying to save my passengers." The room went silent for a moment before the investigator switched off the recorder. "We'll be in touch," he said curtly. As they left, Richard closed his eyes. He knew what they were thinking. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize the pattern, the hunt for someone to blame. Days later, Elaine's team recovered the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder. The CVR was intact, its orange casing scorched but functional. When they played it back, the room fell silent. The recording began with routine chatter between Richard and Mason, light laughter about the weather and fuel report. Then, at timestamp 7 hours 14 minutes and 23 seconds, a faint sound, a clink, followed by something rolling. Mason joked, "There goes your lucky toothpick again." Richard laughed, "Guess I'll have to find it later." The investigators exchanged glances. Elaine's eyes narrowed. "Pause it. Rewind 5 seconds." They replayed it. There it was again, the small sound of wood on metal. When the recording resumed, the voices grew tense. "Throttle's resisting," Mason said. "Engine 2's off balance." Then came the alarms, the shouting, the chaos. Finally, at 7 hours 43 minutes and 9 seconds, Richard's last words. "It's the toothpick." The room was still. Elaine exhaled slowly. "You have got to be kidding me." That night, she couldn't sleep. The idea haunted her, that something so trivial could bring down an aircraft engineered with layers of redundancy, precision, and control. A toothpick. It was absurd. It was impossible. And yet, there it was, recorded in the captain's own voice. She sat at her desk, flipping through photos of the recovered throttles, zooming in on the area where the linkage met the baseplate. And then she saw it, A thin splinter lodged between the throttle guides, blackened by heat but unmistakably wood. Her stomach turned. "Oh my God," she whispered. The next morning, she called the NTSB press liaison. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "We found the cause." When the news broke, the world was stunned. NTSB confirms, Toothpick caused fatal plane crash. The headline went viral. Reporters called it everything from bizarre to tragic. Commentators debated it on morning talk shows. How does something that small cause something that catastrophic? One anchor asked. Experts tried to explain that modern aircraft were complex systems. Even the smallest obstruction could create cascading failures. But for Richard, watching from his hospital bed, the coverage was unbearable. His photo was everywhere, his name dragged through every report. Captain's careless habit linked to deadly crash. The words burned into his mind. He had lost 38 souls under his command, and now, the world saw him as a man undone by a toothpick. In the weeks that followed, lawsuits piled up. Families demanded justice, airlines distanced themselves, and pilots whispered about the absurdity of it all. But Elaine Matthews refused to let the story end there. She dug deeper, reviewing the maintenance logs, the cockpit design schematics, even Richard's psychological evaluations. And that's when she found something no one expected. A report from 5 years earlier detailing throttle sticking on the same aircraft model, traced back to a manufacturing flaw in the throttle housing. A hairline gap in the assembly had been noted and dismissed as non-critical. Elaine's pulse quickened. It wasn't the toothpick, she whispered. It was the design. The toothpick had simply revealed the flaw. And just like that, everything changed. The story the world thought it knew, the careless pilot, the tiny mistake, the tragedy born of superstition, began to unravel. Because in the end, that toothpick wasn't just a symbol of human error. It was the key that unlocked a truth far more terrifying than anyone imagined, that sometimes disasters don't come from what we do wrong, but from what we fail to see. The revelation hit the aviation world like a storm. 4 weeks, headlines had mocked the crash of Flight 721 as a dark irony, the toothpick tragedy, the smallest mistake in the sky, the pilot who fell victim to his habit. But as Elaine Matthews dug deeper, that narrative began to crack wide open. Behind the sensational headlines and the easy scapegoating was a truth no one wanted to confront. It wasn't the toothpick that had brought the aircraft down, it was the system itself. A flaw hidden in plain sight, buried under years of bureaucracy, ignored memos, and corporate negligence. And the deeper Elaine went, the darker it became. She spent long nights in her office at the NTSB headquarters, surrounded by stacks of reports, diagrams, and maintenance record. The air was heavy with the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of the ventilation system. Coffee cups and half-eaten granola bars lined the edge of her desk. Every page told the same story. Minor throttle issues, dismissed anomalies, quick fixes that weren't fixes at all. Engineers had filed complaints about friction in the control levers of the same aircraft model, years before the Flight 721 tragedy. In one report, a technician described how the throttle caught slightly under thermal expansion, especially during long climbs. The memo had been stamped acknowledged and filed away. No recalls, no inspections, no design change. The airline had quietly chosen profit over precision. Elaine rubbed her temples as fatigue set in, her eyes burning from hours of reading. "They knew," she muttered. Her assistant Nolan entered quietly, carrying another stack of documents. "You should get some rest," he said softly. She didn't look up. "Not until we find out how deep this goes." Nolan hesitated. "You've been at it for 48 hours. So has the truth," she replied. "And it's tired of being buried." She flipped through another file, her fingers stopping on a handwritten maintenance note. It was dated 7 months before the crash. The note read, "Throttle linkage binding during manual check, advised replacement of housing unit. Deferred by operations due to scheduling constraint." Her heart sank. deferred. A single word that meant the work had been postponed, likely never done. The plane that would one day become Flight 721 had already shown signs of mechanical resistance long before Richard Hall ever stepped into that cockpit. By the time Elaine looked up again, the sun was rising. Her office was bathed in the pale gold of early morning. She stood, stretching stiff muscles, and walked to the window overlooking the city. Down below, life went on, traffic lights changed, people hurried to work, unaware that the same quiet negligence that killed 38 souls might still exist in the skies above them. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was Nolan. "You need to see this," his text read. 10 minutes later, they were in the NTSB lab examining a recovered component, the throttle base assembly from Flight 721. The metal was charred and warped, but the faint lines of stress cracks were visible along the lower joint. Elaine crouched close, her breath fogging the glass. "Look here," she said, pointing. "This isn't from impact. It fractured from inside out. The toothpick didn't jam it, it exposed the weakness." Nolan frowned. "So the crash was inevitable?" She nodded slowly. "Eventually, yes. The design was always going to fail. The toothpick just got there first. The next step was contacting the manufacturer. They had no choice but to bring the evidence forward. But Elaine knew what that meant. Corporate denial, legal threats, spin control. By the time she and Nolan arrived at the aerospace company's headquarters, reporters had already swarmed the building. Cameras flashed, questions flew, and security guards pushed back the crowd. Inside, a sleek, cold conference room awaited them. Across the table sat 3 executives, their smiles polite but hollow. "We've reviewed your preliminary findings," one began. "And while we appreciate your diligence, we believe this is an isolated event." Elaine's expression hardened. "Isolated? There are 7 documented cases of throttle friction on your aircraft model in the last 3 years. None resulted in loss of control," the man replied evenly. "Which suggests pilot error was still the determining factor in this case." Elaine leaned forward, her voice low but steady. "Your own engineers flagged this defect years ago. You ignored them." The room went still. The lead executive, a silver-haired man with the tone of practiced authority, gave a small smile. "Ms. Matthews, we all know the public loves a good villain. The story of a careless captain and a dropped toothpick is compelling. Why complicate it?" Her hands clenched into fists. "Because it's not the truth." The man's smile faded. "Be careful, Ms. Matthews. The truth doesn't always survive in this business." The words hung in the air like smoke. As she and Nolan left the building, she could feel the weight of something pressing down on them, the invisible machinery of silence, already spinning to protect itself. "They'll bury this," Nolan said quietly. "Not if we get it out first," Elaine replied. Meanwhile, Captain Richard Hall sat alone in his small rehabilitation room, a half-eaten meal tray untouched beside him. The walls were sterile white, the kind that made everything feel temporary, even guilt. His right hand was still bandaged from burns, the skin beneath mottled and scarred. He replayed the final seconds of the flight in his mind again and again, each time hoping for a different outcome. He could still hear Mason shouting, the alarms screaming, the sound of metal tearing apart. He still felt the heat of the throttles beneath his hands, the sting of burning metal, and the final resistance breaking as the toothpick came free. That was the moment everything had ended, and the moment he thought he might have saved them, if only for a second. The press called him the toothpick captain, now, their tone mocking, cruel. Strangers on the street left letters outside the hospital, some forgiving, most not. He had become a symbol, not a man. And all he wanted was to make them understand that it wasn't carelessness. It was a flaw he couldn't see. When Elaine walked into his room 2 weeks later, he didn't recognize her at first. "Captain Hall," she said gently, holding out her ID. "I'm with the NTSB investigation team." He looked up, weary. "You're here to finish what the reporters started?" She shook her head. "I'm here to tell you the truth. She laid a file on the bedside table. We found the cause. It wasn't the toothpick. His eyes widened slightly. What? The linkage assembly had a manufacturing defect. The wood just made it worse. He stared at her, disbelief and exhaustion warring in his expression. You're saying this wasn't my fault? I'm saying it never should have happened, she replied softly. For the first time since the crash, something in Richard's chest loosened. He exhaled shakily, his voice breaking. They let 38 people die for a defect. They'll try to hide it, Elaine said. But I won't let them. He nodded slowly, his voice a whisper. Then you're braver than most who fly. By the next morning, the airline's legal department had already sent warnings to the NTSB about unverified claims and defamation risk. But Elaine didn't stop. She contacted journalists she trusted, sending them pieces of evidence under the table, the maintenance reports, the memos, the fracture photos. One evening, an email arrived from an anonymous source within the company. The message was short but devastating. You're right. The defect was known. They just didn't want the cost of a recall. Attached was an internal memo stamped confidential. It outlined cost-benefit calculations, how much it would cost to fix the issue versus the projected risk of failure. Elaine read the last line aloud in disbelief. Estimated probability of fatal incident, less than 0.003%, acceptable risk. Her stomach turned. Human lives had been reduced to decimal point. That night, she sat in her car outside the NTSB building, rain streaking the windshield, her hands trembling as she read the memo again. The city lights reflected in her eyes like distant fires. She thought of Richard, haunted in his hospital bed. She thought of the passengers who never made it home. And she thought of the headline that had mocked them all, the toothpick that revealed a shocking truth. It wasn't just a headline anymore. It was prophecy. Because the truth it revealed wasn't about a toothpick or a pilot. It was about an entire system built on denial, where the smallest thing could expose the largest lie. And deep down, Elaine knew what she had to do next. The world deserved to know, even if it meant burning her own career to the ground. The night before Elaine Matthews made her move, the city outside her window was silent except for the soft hiss of rain against the glass. She sat alone in her small apartment, surrounded by folders and documents that could destroy one of the most powerful aerospace corporations in the world. Each page on her desk carried weight, the names of engineers who had warned their superiors, memos signed by executives who had chosen silence, and the haunting calculations that valued human life as mere fractions of a percent. The words blurred before her tired eyes, but one sentence kept burning through the fog of exhaustion. Acceptable risk. She whispered the phrase out loud, her voice shaking. 38 people are dead because of your acceptable risk. She glanced at the photograph pinned to her board. The passengers of Flight 721, a collage printed from news archives. Families, couples, children. Ordinary lives. Each one now a data point in a spreadsheet. She felt a tremor run through her as the weight of the truth settled deeper. This wasn't an accident. This was a cover-up. Across the city, inside a glass tower lit like a beacon in the rain, the executives of Aerodyne Aerospace held a private emergency meeting. The CEO, a man named Victor Crane, stood at the head of a long table. His voice was calm, but his tone carried the cold authority of someone who had built his empire on control. The Matthews report cannot reach the press, he said flatly. We're already seeing noise online. If this leaks, our stock collapses, our contracts are frozen, and our board collapses. One of the lawyers spoke hesitantly. We can't suppress an NTSB investigator indefinitely. If she's already shared evidence, then discredit her, Victor interrupted. Find something. A mistake in her report, a conflict of interest, anything. We control the narrative, not her. The room fell silent. Rain lashed against the windows like applause from Ghost. And what about Captain Hall? Another executive asked quietly. Victor's eyes narrowed. He's a liability. A sympathetic one. If he speaks, he turns this into a crusade. Keep him quiet. Meanwhile, Elaine was already ahead of them. She had copied the files onto a secure drive, hidden in a plain manila envelope, sealed under layers of documents that only she could decipher. Her heart pounded as she composed an encrypted email to a journalist named Daniel Mercer, a trusted contact from her early career. She typed the words carefully. I have proof Flight 721 was not caused by pilot error. The evidence points to a manufacturer defect covered up for years. If I disappear, this email is your signal to release everything. Truth dies in silence. Let's make sure it doesn't. She hovered over the send button, hesitation clawing at her chest. Once she hit send, there would be no turning back. She would lose her job, her reputation, maybe even her safety. But then she remembered the faces in that photograph and thought of Captain Hall, haunted and broken, accused of killing people he'd tried to save. Her finger pressed the button. The email went out into the world like a spark into dry grass. The next morning, the world shifted. Daniel Mercer's investigative article appeared online at dawn, titled Flight 721, The Hidden Cost of Silence. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. The story detailed everything: the deferred maintenance orders, the ignored warnings, the confidential memo with the fatal line about acceptable risk. It included a statement from Captain Richard Hall himself, speaking publicly for the first time since the crash. His words were steady but heavy with pain. I made mistakes that day, but none as great as trusting a system that valued schedules over souls. The world listened. Social media erupted with outrage. Hashtags like #Flight721Truth and #JusticeFor721 trended worldwide. Victims' families gathered outside Aerodyne's headquarters, holding photos of their loved ones, their voices breaking as they demanded accountability. Inside the NTSB, chaos erupted. Elaine was called into a closed-door meeting with her superiors. The director's expression was unreadable. You went behind protocol, he said sternly. You leaked confidential evidence. I exposed the truth, she replied. You exposed this agency, he shot back. Do you realize what you've done? Congress will have our heads. Aerodyne's lawyers are already circling. Elaine took a deep breath, her voice steady. Let them circle. The truth is out. You can't bury it anymore. The director's silence spoke volumes. Finally, he sighed. You're suspended pending review. She nodded slowly, her heart breaking but not surprised. If that's what it costs, she said softly, then it's worth it. That evening, as the sun sank behind the city skyline, news channels aired exclusive interviews, debates, and footage of angry crowds outside Aerodyne offices across the country. Former engineers came forward anonymously, confirming what Elaine had uncovered. One even described the exact moment the company buried the first warning about the throttle defect. They said fixing it would take time and money, the voice said through distortion. And no one wanted to delay deliveries. The government announced an immediate investigation. Aerodyne's stock plummeted overnight. For the first time, Victor Crane's perfect empire began to crack. But power rarely falls without a fight. Late that night, Elaine's phone buzzed while she sat alone on a park bench, her mind heavy but unyielding. It was a blocked number. She hesitated before answering. A man's voice came through, low and precise. You've made quite a mess, Ms. Matthews. Her pulse quickened. Who is this? Someone who thinks you should have stayed in your lane. She could hear faint city sounds in the background, a car horn, footsteps, maybe rain. You think this is over? He continued. Aerodyne has friends in places you can't imagine. You can't protect the truth if you're gone. She hung up immediately, her heart racing, and walked quickly toward the streetlight. Fear clawed at her chest, but she refused to stop. They wanted to scare her. They wanted her quiet. But it was too late for that. At the same time, Captain Richard Hall sat in his home, watching the news unfold. For the first time since the crash, He saw the world begin to understand. His name appeared on the screen, not as a scapegoat, but as a man who had tried to save lives despite impossible odds. The commentator said, "Captain Hall's last words before impact. It's the toothpick now stand as a haunting metaphor for how the smallest detail exposed a massive corporate failure." Richard turned off the television, his eyes filling with quiet tears. The pain of the crash would never fade, but tonight, he felt something new, a fragile sense of redemption. The days that followed were chaos. Congressional hearings began, cameras flashing as executives squirmed under oath. Elaine testified with calm clarity, her voice unwavering as she recited the facts. "They called it acceptable risk," she said. "They gambled with human lives and lost." Her testimony became the heart of the hearings, replayed across every major network. Families applauded her bravery, while Victor Crane sat in the audience, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with hatred. When asked if he had any remorse, he said coldly, "Business decisions are made every day. You can't eliminate risk. You can only manage it." That single line sealed his fate. Within weeks, criminal charges were filed. Aerodyne executives were indicted for fraud and negligence. The company's planes were grounded worldwide. The story dominated headlines for months, becoming one of the most significant corporate scandals in aviation history. But for Elaine, the victory felt bittersweet. She had lost her career, her privacy, and the quiet anonymity she once cherished. Still, every time she saw a plane fly safely across the sky, she knew it was worth it. One night, months later, she received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a simple piece of metal, the charred remains of the throttle lever from Flight 721, mounted on a small wooden base. A note beneath it read, "Because of you, they'll never call it acceptable again. R.H." She smiled faintly, tears welling in her eyes. Somewhere, she knew Captain Hall had found peace. And in that quiet moment, under the same stars that had once witnessed tragedy, Elaine realized that sometimes the truth doesn't crash, it lands exactly where it's meant to. The world had erupted into a storm of consequences. The headlines that once mocked Captain Richard Hall now hailed him as a symbol of resilience. The truth that Elaine Matthews risked everything to expose had grown beyond her control, rippling across nations, shaking governments, and bringing a billion-dollar corporation to its knees. The name, Flight 721, became synonymous with accountability. But for those at the heart of it all, the aftermath was far more complicated. Elaine found herself a reluctant hero, standing at the center of a media whirlwind she never wanted. Her image appeared on talk shows, documentaries, and investigative specials, always labeled the same way: the whistleblower who grounded a giant. Yet in the quiet moments, when the cameras were gone, she felt the loneliness of someone who had given up everything for truth. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages: gratitude from victims' families, threats from anonymous accounts, offers from publishers and producers, but none of it filled the hollow silence that came after justice. At the same time, Captain Hall tried to rebuild his life. He had moved to a small coastal town, a place where the sound of waves replaced the roar of engines. Each morning, he would walk the shoreline, his limp barely noticeable now, though his hands still carried faint scars. Sometimes, the townsfolk recognized him, whispering as he passed, "That's the pilot from 721. Some approached to shake his hand, others simply watched, unsure what to say to a man who had survived what no one should have. He didn't mind. He had made peace with their curiosity. In the evenings, he'd sit on the porch of a rented cabin, listening to the wind and reading the newspaper headlines about Aerodyne's collapse. Hundreds of lawsuits. Executives resigning in disgrace. Victor Crane under investigation for fraud. Justice was happening, but for Richard it felt distant, a story told about someone else. Meanwhile, in a sleek prison complex far from the city, Victor Crane sat behind a reinforced glass partition, dressed in gray, his once confident posture replaced by the slow weariness of a man who had lost everything but his pride. Across from him sat a journalist, microphone clipped to her blouse. "Do you have anything you'd like to say to the victims' families?" she asked. He smiled faintly, his voice calm, almost polite. "People die in aviation accidents every year," he said. "It's the price of progress." "You falsified reports," she pressed. "You buried evidence." His eyes hardened. "And you published lies," he replied. "We all do what we must to survive in our professions." When the interview aired, the world recoiled. His lack of remorse ignited public fury anew. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse chanting, "No acceptable risk," over and over until their voices became the heartbeat of a movement. For the first time in decades, aviation reform bills passed through Congress without resistance, mandating stricter oversight, transparency, and whistleblower protections. Flight 721 had become more than a tragedy, it was a revolution. But revolutions leave scars. Elaine's suspension from the NTSB turned permanent. She was labeled a security risk, unofficially blacklisted from future government work. Yet, she refused to disappear. When a small network approached her about hosting a documentary series on aviation safety, she accepted. The first episode aired 6 months later, titled, "The Toothpick That Revealed a Shocking Truth." Her narration was calm but haunting, her voice guiding viewers through every second of the flight, the sound of the alarms, the desperate struggle in the cockpit, and the moment when Richard's burned hand pulled out that cursed splinter of wood. It wasn't dramatization, it was remembrance. The series became a sensation, watched by millions. But what struck audiences most was the ending, where Elaine spoke directly into the camera and said, "We call them accidents because it's easier than calling them choices. But every cut corner, every ignored warning, every life lost, those aren't accidents. They're decisions made by people who thought they'd never be caught." Flight 721 caught them. After the episode aired, she received a letter, handwritten, not emailed. The handwriting was neat, firm, unmistakably deliberate. "You saved me," it began. "Not from the crash, but from the silence after. You made them hear what I couldn't say. I don't know what the future holds, but if you ever need a co-pilot, you know where to find me. R.H." Elaine smiled when she read it, her throat tightening. The letter smelled faintly of salt air, as if it had traveled from the coast. She placed it in a small wooden box on her desk, beside the charred throttle lever and her original case files, the relics of a truth she had dragged into the light. Months passed. The world moved on, as it always does. News cycles shifted, scandals faded, and new tragedies took center stage. But every so often, the story resurfaced. A new documentary, a book, a college lecture about ethics in aviation. And each time, someone would repeat the line that had come to define it all. He dropped a toothpick, and that's when the terrifying truth came out. It became legend, a cautionary tale told to every new pilot, engineer, and corporate executive. A reminder that no system is too big to fail, and no lie too small to hide forever. One evening, long after the noise had faded, Elaine found herself standing on a quiet airfield under a crimson sunset. She had been invited to give a talk at a safety seminar, her first public appearance in months. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and damp grass, a scent that pulled her back to the day she first walked the wreckage site of Flight 721. After the event, as the audience dispersed, she noticed a man leaning against a fence at the edge of the runway, tall, weathered, wearing a simple jacket. She knew instantly who it was. Richard Hall smiled as she approached, that same calm in his eyes she'd seen in the photos from before the crash. "You never did like reporters," she teased softly. "Only the honest ones," he replied. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching a plane ascend into the reddening sky. "Do you ever fly again?" she asked. He shook his head. "Not anymore. But sometimes I like to watch others take off. Reminds me that the sky forgives, even if people don't." Elaine looked at him thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about them? The passengers?" His gaze didn't waver. "Every day. But now, when I do, it doesn't hurt the same way. I like to think they'd be proud of what came after. The wind picked up, carrying the faint hum of another aircraft climbing into the distance. You know, she said, they called it the Toothpick tragedy. But it was never about that little piece of wood. It was about what it exposed. Richard nodded slowly. Truth always starts small. It's the lies that grow too big. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson, Elaine and Richard stood together, silent witnesses to the very thing they had both nearly lost: trust. The engines of a departing jet roared overhead, fading into the vastness of the sky, and for the first time since the crash, Richard Hall smiled, truly smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes softening. You know, he said, his voice quiet but steady, I used to think flying was about control, keeping everything perfect, predictable. But now I think it's about letting go. The sky doesn't belong to us. We just borrow it. Elaine's eyes glistened as she looked up at the endless expanse above. Then maybe, she whispered, we finally gave it back. And as they walked away, the runway lights flickered to life behind them, stretching into the dark like a path of memory and forgiveness. Somewhere high above, another plane soared safely through the night, a silent tribute to those who had fallen, and to the few who refused to let their voices be lost beneath the clouds. The months following the hearings changed everything. The crash of Flight 721 no longer lived only in reports or black boxes. It had become a story told in classrooms, training sessions, and every aviation boardroom that feared the next hidden mistake. The words acceptable risk vanished from manuals, replaced by something human again: responsibility. But for those who had carried the truth through fire, peace did not come easily. Elaine Matthews found herself in a small mountain cabin far from the city lights, seeking quiet after the noise of headlines faded. The air there was cold, clean, and free from the endless hum of aircraft overhead. At night she still dreamed of the cockpit recording, of the way Captain Hall's voice broke in the final seconds, of the sound of metal groaning before the ocean swallowed it all. She would wake with her heart racing, step outside into the dark forest air, and remind herself that they hadn't died for nothing. The truth had landed safely, even if she still hadn't. In that same quiet stretch of coastline where Richard Hall had made his home, the world had begun to heal in small ways. Tourists walked the beaches without knowing that somewhere beneath the waves rested fragments of the jet that had rewritten aviation law. Sometimes, when the tide was unusually low, twisted pieces of aluminum would surface, dull and barnacled, and the locals would call the authorities to collect them. Richard always watched from afar, never interfering. To him, the sea had already claimed what it needed to. He'd become a local legend, the pilot who lived, they called him, but he wanted no fame, only forgiveness. Every few months he spoke at training academies, not about procedure or instruments, but about humility. The cockpit is not a throne, he would tell young cadets. It's a confession booth. You sit there not to prove control, but to earn it. His words carried more weight than any manual. Then one morning, as sunlight broke across the horizon, a letter arrived at his door. The envelope bore no name, only a small government insignia in the corner. Inside was a formal invitation, a ceremony to commemorate the victims of Flight 721 and to honor the reforms that had followed. For the first time, both he and Elaine were listed as honorees. He stared at the paper for a long time, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the framed photo of his old crew, Mason, Carla, and himself, smiling in the cockpit years before any of them knew how fragile that happiness was. That night, he walked along the shore and whispered into the wind, "We did it." The waves answered with their steady rhythm, eternal and forgiving. Weeks later, the ceremony took place at the newly built Memorial Hall of Flight 721. Families filled the seats, their faces softened by time but still shadowed by memory. A massive mural stretched across the back wall, an abstract painting of a rising sun breaking through clouds, streaked with faint silver to symbolize metal turned to light. Elaine stood near the podium, her hair pulled back neatly, her expression calm but distant. When she saw Richard step inside, their eyes met, and for a moment the weight of everything, the loss, the guilt, the victory, seemed to lift. "You came," she said quietly when he reached her. "Wouldn't have missed it," he replied. "You kept your promise." She smiled faintly. "So did you." The ceremony was simple but powerful. The names of the passengers were read aloud, each one echoing through the chamber like a heartbeat. Families wept quietly, hands clasped around one another. When it was Richard's turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone slowly, the sound of his footsteps filling the silence. "I've been called many things since that day," he began. "A survivor, a fool, a hero. But I'm none of those things. I'm a man who dropped a toothpick and learned how fragile perfection really is. That toothpick didn't kill anyone. What did was the arrogance that thought small things didn't matter." He paused, his voice catching. "The truth is, they always matter. Every bolt, every warning, every voice that says, 'Stop, something's wrong.' We have to listen. Because if we don't, the sky remembers." When Elaine took the stage after him, she didn't read from her note. She spoke simply, directly, as if talking to the ghosts that still lingered in the room. "I used to think truth was a destination," she said softly. "Something you reach at the end of an investigation. But it's not. It's a journey, one you take every day, in every decision, in every moment you choose to look closer instead of turning away. Flight 721 taught me that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a man sitting in a cockpit, refusing to give up until the very last second. Sometimes it's the families who keep demanding answers long after the world has moved on. And sometimes it's just a toothpick falling in the wrong place that reminds us all how fragile everything really is." When she finished, the audience rose in silence, no applause, just the heavy, shared sound of breathing, the kind that only comes from people remembering what it means to be human. After the ceremony, they stood together outside beneath the open sky. The wind smelled of rain and jet fuel, the same scent that had haunted them both for years. "You ever think we'll stop being defined by this?" Elaine asked. Richard thought for a moment. "No," he said. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. The world learned something it won't forget. That's worth being remembered for." She nodded, her gaze drifting upward as a plane roared faintly above the clouds. "Do you think they know? The passengers?" He smiled faintly. "If there's a sky beyond this one, I like to think they're still flying. Peacefully this time." That night, back in her hotel room, Elaine turned on the news. The story was already everywhere: clips of the ceremony, sound bites of Richard's speech, and images of families placing flowers by the names etched into the memorial wall. But one headline stood out: "From Toothpick to Truth, How Flight 721 Changed the Skies Forever." She turned off the television and sat in the dark for a long moment, listening to the soft hum of a plane passing high above. It sounded different now, less like machinery, more like music. Outside, far beyond city lights and coastlines, the world went on. Planes crossed continents, passengers slept in seats miles above the earth, and in every cockpit, somewhere, a pilot checked the throttles one more time, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because they all knew the story. They all knew how small things mattered. And though time would dull the details, the message would remain, written in regulations, whispered in training, etched into the hearts of everyone who dared to command the sky. And for Elaine Matthews and Captain Richard Hall, the story of Flight 721 would never truly end. It would live on in the stillness before takeoff, in the calm after landing, and in every breath of silence that followed the words, "Welcome aboard." Because sometimes the greatest truths don't just survive disaster, they take flight from it. Thank you for listening. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel for more powerful, true air disaster stories where courage meets consequence and humanity finds meaning in the sky. Until next time, fly safe.